People like you belong in the kitchen, my mother-in-law would say to humiliate me. She said it the way someone drops a stone into a pond, watching the ripples take themselves seriously. The words landed at the edge of my plate, on the rim of my glass, threaded into the laughter that came after like a cruel punctuation. The room smelled of roast and candle wax, of lemon that refused to cut through everything she thought she knew about me. I remember the way my hands were warm from washing the salad bowls, knuckles still pink from the hot water, and how the skin on my thumb peeled where I'd scrubbed at a stubborn stain. I remember Jonah's jaw tightening, the small, private language of a man who wanted to say more, but could only keep his mouth shut, because he had learned, painfully, that silence sometimes buys safety. We had come to her townhouse for a Sunday supper that had been announced as an opportunity for family harmony. She called it bringing the branches together. In her world, bringing together meant arranging the leaves in an order she approved. The guests spoke in the soft, careful cadence of people who ate well and believed themselves entitled to judge nourishment. My mother-in-law, Evelyn Harrow by birth and by business, presided like a minor sovereign. Her opinions on property lines, on child-rearing, on what constituted good women, were delivered in the flat voice of someone convinced she was stating facts, and facts are unassailable. "People like you," she said, and the words did something that pure insult cannot do. They rearranged the anatomy of the table, made the chairs closer to those who measured worth by last names and donations. I felt the table tilt. The conversation shifted. Jonah's brother coughed and redirected the laughter. I sat very still until the suspicion and shame that swell in places that have no soft tissue to receive them withdrew into something tight and useful. I picked up a napkin and unfolded it, smoothing the crease with fingers that had learned to still tremble under public attention. After everyone left and the house quieted to a hum and a chair scraped at the hearth, Jonah found me in the kitchen with my palms in a basin of steaming water. He had that look people get when they are deciding between a confession and a protective silence, the sort of look men carve into their faces when they've been schooled by experience in what speech costs. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was all apology and not apology, the sort you give for someone else's cruelty, not for your own hand in making it possible. "It's fine," I told him. The lie was small and useful. "It's dinner, not doctrine." He didn't laugh. Instead, he traced the scald line up my thumb with a fingertip, as if by touch he could memorize both the pain and its cure. "She'll keep at it," he said. "She always does." "She likes to feel big," I said. "Sometimes she wants everyone to be tiny around her, so she doesn't have to feel small."
Jonah's face shifted at that. He left the sink and went to the window where the town's streetlight smeared its pale light across the pavement. For a long time he watched the dark, and whatever passed alarmed him in the streetlight's smear kept him there, silent and contained. He had been raised in that same house, shaped by the same hands that now made the stone skip. He knew the ledger, the players, the way favors could be written on paper and made to look like law. He also knew how hard it was to tear a favored story apart when it had been told long enough. That week we received the first paper, a certified letter with the county seal in the neat official font of someone who believed authority could be honest, a challenge to our title, an assertion that the property we had bought, the small clapboard house Jonah and I had stubbornly worked at restoring himself, the drafty windows, the crooked porch, the garden where I had planted beans beside a little statue of a girl with a watering can, was not ours. There were signatures, stamps, notarized attestations. There were dates that neatly predated the sale, and a line that declared, in the kind of language designed to make people fold, that the deed had been transferred back to Evelyn Harrow by right of inheritance years ago. The first time I read it in the kitchen, the paper was cold between my fingers. Words that had no warmth for me suggested a new geography of a place I thought was my home. My throat tightened, but I had learned to speak with the thing that wanted to swallow me. I folded and refolded that page until its edges softened, and Jonah watched in the doorway, one hand in his coat pocket, as if bracing for weather. "Someone must have made a mistake," he said. He sounded like a man who still believed in clerical errors and kind attentions. "Or a lot of someone's," I replied, "or one very determined someone." It was the sort of claim that, in quieter towns and in better books, would have been resolved by truth and patience. Here, the story works differently. Power can manufacture proof. If you have the right lawyer, the right banker, the right friend at the registry office, you can make paper say the thing you want it to, and the town will read it as gospel. Evelyn had both the friends and the resources to make any paper speak with authority. She also had a reputation to protect, one that depended on every household within a 3-mile radius remembering whose hand signed the checks and whose table was to be sat at. We went to the county office because we had to know what lay beyond the neat font. The records clerk was a woman with a voice like a stapler and hair scraped back into a practical bun. She took the papers, typed in the numbers, and produced a ledger page that looked nothing like the neat stamped claim we had been sent.
There, in black and white and the clerk's cursor hum, the trail twisted in a way Evelyn's neat letter hadn't accounted for. A series of edits, a misplaced date, a signature in a hand that didn't match the one on our original deed. "These are old," the clerk said, tapping the screen and then looking at us as if deciding whether we were the sort of people who needed help or the sort who caused paperwork to become moral terrain. "We had a system change 3 years back. When you update, sometimes the old metadata stays." She paused and then blinked as if catching herself. "But these timestamps, someone altered the file after the update. They shouldn't be able to do that without an admin log. They didn't have access." Jonah's shoulders went harder and more protective. "Who would gain from altering the file?" he asked. The clerk lifted her hands, palms outward as if to ward off involvement, and yet leaning forward in that way anyone does when they want to help but must first count the risk. "You'd be surprised who knows the right people," she said. "And sometimes the money don't need to know the right people. The right people answer the phone." When the word forgery slipped into that room, it was the same as dropping a cup into water and hearing it break. It changed the air. There was an edge to the light that hadn't been there before. The clerk looked at us with a mixture of sympathy and tightness. "I'll print everything for you," she said, "but you'll need a lawyer. If there's tampering, it will show in the server logs. Someone will have to be willing to ask for them." We left with a stack of paper that smelled faintly of toner and a printout of a digital chain that was more likely to be useful to a lawyer than to a woman who learned bookkeeping by the weight of a ledger. The house felt smaller the walk home. The porch sagged a hair more like a shoulder. The beans had sent up little tendrils in the garden, and I touched the rigging of them like a map of what counted. When we got to the back door, a neighbor I didn't often see stood on the path, knitting something in her hands so she had less ammunition for idle questions. Her name was Louise. She had the kind of face that wore time like a coat, fitted and a little frayed. "I saw Evelyn in the registry last month," she said without preamble, as if she were handing over a small, inconvenient truth. "She was with Mr. Kittredge, the accountant. She had an envelope. I thought she was taking care of taxes." She blinked and then added, as if remembering the weight of such things. She looked upset, not angry, nervous. "Nervous?" I repeated. Louise fiddled with her needles. "She doesn't look nervous," she said. "Not the way she looked. She looked like someone trying to make sure something was done right. I can't say more than that, but I thought you should know. Little acts of neighborliness can feel like contraband in a town that executes loyalty like a verdict."
Louise was small in the recounting, not heroic. She was a pair of eyes and a memory that possibly would not have mattered without the clerk's printout. But she mattered more than she knew. Often justice piles up not at the courthouse, but in the quiet inventory of people's recollections. We hired an attorney with hands that smelled faintly of coffee and a tie that refused to be neutered by the seriousness of his paperwork. He asked for money up front, a retainer that was the sort of number that made me rearrange my future in my head, subtracting groceries and repairs and the money I had set aside for a new pair of boots. Jonah covered the fee. He withdrew from his savings, the small account he kept for emergencies and for the kinds of things you protect because nothing else matters more than sleep. It was a small act. It wasn't dramatic in the way of standing in a public square with a megaphone. It was not the cinematic relinquishment of birthright or fortune. He signed a check. He scribbled a number on a line and handed it over with his mouth set in that stubborn way he had whenever things required more than his hands. Paying a retainer in our town was hardly a revolutionary gesture, but it cost him more than money. It cost him a willingness to be seen as an ally against his own tribe. "Be careful," his sister told him on the phone when she heard the news. "You can't pick a side and not expect consequences." "Which side would that be?" Jonah replied, and his voice was light and almost wry, but it held a quiet tremor. "The side that believes in keeping promises, or the side that believes in protecting a family's name at all costs?" He didn't say he had been cut out of the family's business when he was 27. He didn't say how he had witnessed numbers being moved, and how when he'd spoken he'd been told to shut up and take his portion. He didn't say how the family had banished him emotionally with the same efficiency they had once banished him from the boardroom. But the retainer was a small, capacious thing, the seed money for a fight that would ask him to step into a place she had always kept him out of, the public. We worked in the evenings, after the paper had been folded and the accountant's meeting was a memory that smelled like coffee and stale bread.
In the small hours, we sat at the kitchen table and went through receipts and mortgage statements and old emails Jonah had found in a backup. On nights when arguments made our shoulders ache, we braided each other's hair. He was a ridiculous intimacy, a small, private ritual that was part practical and part conjuration. He had thick hair that resisted arrangements, and I had fingers that remembered my mother's hands on my head when I was small. We would sit shoulder to shoulder, and he would let me weave, and the motion of my fingers would be a litany. I am here. I am choosing you. I will not relegate you to the corners of someone else's story.
There were other nights when he told me why he kept quiet around his family. He told me about the time his father had insisted, during a summer that smelled of tar and paint, that loyalty meant keeping silent, and that truth was negotiable if it kept the business front bright. Jonah had been 22, and had watched a man who'd taught him to measure worth by handshake and ledger, close his eyes and let a lie pass for the sake of reputation. The lie had cost a worker's pension. Jonah had spoken up, and been punished with exile. He had carried the memory like a hidden map of shame. "You think you can fix this with money?" I'd asked once, in a moment of angry exhaustion. "You think you can show them how wrong they are by writing checks?" He looked at me then, genuine, blunt, and the look said the thing he had been avoiding. "This isn't about the money. It's about who I will be in the end." I thought of the way a woman who loved a man sometimes has to choose not to let him be the martyr for her dignity. I thought of the way a marriage should be a place of reckoning, where you choose one another, not a ledger to be balanced. I thought of my mother-in-law's words, and how they tried to carve me into a domestic fixture in a room full of men who kept ledgers and women who kept silence. I thought how the choice to stay and fight said something louder than any retainer check. The first public moment arrived sooner than we expected. The town's small council was called to a hearing because the lawyer representing Evelyn wanted the town to recognize a temporary injunction that would prevent us from making any alterations to our property until the ownership issue was resolved. They framed it as a matter of conservation, of historic propriety. On their letterhead, the word appeal sounded legal and pristine. The hearing room was a school gymnasium with its varnished floor and a smell like varnish and cheap coffee. People came because they loved watching a public unravel. They came because they had time, and because small towns thrive on spectacle. There were county officials, a sprinkling of reporters who wore neutral faces as they held pens, and 2 rows of people who were evidently there to support Evelyn, the sort of people who like being seen with the wealthy. In the second row sat Jonah's uncle, with his folded hands and the kind of expression that had once been pity, and now was plainly thin-lipped judgment. When my name was called to speak, my mouth was oddly calm. It was the way a woman steadies her voice to call a child's name across a playground. "People like you belong in the kitchen," Evelyn had said, in a way that intended to place me under family law. It was a line that wanted public witness. I could have walked away and made her words evaporate like smoke. Instead, I went to the microphone because there are times when silence does not save you. Silence can be a kind of complicity.
I told the council the story of the house, of the way the rafters had been notched by Jonah's hands, of the jars of nails in the shed, of the morning when I first saw the beans push their green fingers through the soil. I told them about the smell of lemon and roast in Evelyn's dining room, and the way those words landed like ballast. I spoke of the certified letter we had received, and of the printouts the clerk had handed us. I explained with as much measured calm as I could that we believed the record had been tampered with, and that we were pursuing the matter legally. Jonah had sat, but not too still. When I finished, when the room shifted into the uncomfortable interval where the law gets its first breath, he rose. He walked to the microphone in the same quiet way he walked into a room when he had once been sent away. He did not speak to elevate himself or to perform a hero's part. He spoke to correct a story. "I was born in the house that sits on that property," he said. The words were not meant as a claim of ownership, but as something older, a mapping. "My family taught me a lot about the way accounts are kept and how stories are told to look like facts. I will not pretend the Harrow name is all kindness, but what I will say is this. I chose this house. I didn't buy it as a favor. I didn't take it as charity. My wife and I worked to make it ours. That work is part of who we are." He did not say I left my mother because she was wrong. He did not say I renounced her. He stepped into a different truth. He voiced what was ours without theatrics. He stepped forward and, in doing so, made a small sacrifice. He turned his back on the neatness of family loyalty and stepped toward the messy truth that sometimes family must be rejected in order to keep a better version of family. There was a ripple of murmurs. Evelyn's supporters smiled like sharks' hearts with teeth just below the surface. Her eyes were narrow, not angry, but rather delighted at an opportunity to appear wronged. Jonah's uncle was visibly displeased, his lips configured into a fine, controlled scowl. For a moment I thought maybe we had imagined an ally. For a moment I worried his act would only make the spear sharper. After the meeting, as we walked home under a sky that smelled faintly of summer and rain,
A man in a suit I didn't recognize pushed a piece of paper into my hands. It was a petition, a small thing, like a child's drawing, promising to uphold the historic integrity of the neighborhood. It had signatures that looked ordinary and a note in curly handwriting that thanked Evelyn for her steadfast devotion to keeping our town's character intact. It was the kind of thing aimed at convincing the public that a deed was a duty to heritage rather than a sheet of potentially forged signatures. You forced him to choose, Louise said later, when she came by with a pie so as to be less of a neighbor and more of a righteous emissary. He didn't have to stand there.
He could have folded. He did have to, I said. If he's going to be whole, he has to choose the side that tells truth. That costs people, she said, worrying the pastry's crust. It costs him his place at some tables. I thought of the retainer and the quiet way Jonah had signed the check. I thought of the price lines that ran under loyalty, and of how love sometimes means being willing to pay more for better currency. In the days that followed, we discovered other traces. An email chain with a subject line that looked innocuous, closing documents, contained a version history with a name and the audit trail that belonged to a person we had not expected, a notary's assistant who had resigned a year ago after a dispute over bookkeeping. We found a backup of a scanned signature that was different from the official-looking claim we had been sent. When the file was magnified, small inconsistencies showed up like fingerprints, a stroke where an O was curved wrong, a pressure point in the pen where the line should be light. Each small revelation was a kindling. We moved slowly because a hurried blaze attracts everyone, and sometimes the kindling you gather is less solid than it appears. We needed a witness. We needed a clerk who would step out of the hinge of fear and testify that she had seen edits after hours. We needed someone who would remember seeing Evelyn druffed into the registry with a man carrying a leather envelope. It is a curious thing how courage operates in other people's lives. It is not always the heroic cinematic uprising. Often it is quiet. A clerk who decides to print a log, a neighbor who says she remembers a face, a husband who writes a check and goes to the podium and says his wife is his partner. The story hinged on such small human treasons and fidelities. And yet retaliation arrived like weather. First, it was a smear online, an op-ed piece posted by an anonymous account that claimed we had abused the house, that we sought to strip a family of its legacy for personal gain. It was phrased in the language of concern for heritage, all soft edges and righteous indignation. The comments under it were the usual curious people, and the more vicious, the kind that dissected a marriage in the same way a butcher dissects a shoulder of beef. I watched the words pour under corners of my life like ants. Then a notice arrived, a complaint filed with the town's historical commission saying we had made unauthorized structural changes, accompanied by a photograph of our porch with a board leaning at an angle. Distrust ballooned in the town. People who had once smiled at me now had a thinness to their hospitality when I passed them in grocery aisles. Jonah's sister stopped answering texts. Jonah's uncle tightened the way a man tightens a belt, more efficient, less generous. Our electricity was cut the week after the hearing. It was a small blow and a loud noise. We came home after a day's slog with boxes of legal documents, feeling the way one feels when a night's sleep has torn. The porch light didn't flicker, the kettle cold in the cupboard. It could have been a missed bill, but the timing tasted like threat. Jonah made calls and discovered that a lien had been filed in a way that required the power company to act. He swore under his breath, and I watched him make the calls that would try to threat us out of a sudden public exposure. He hammered at the telephone like someone trying to force open a window. When he hung up, he looked at the dark house and then at me. "This is escalation," he said. "It is," I replied. That night, under the thin light of candles, we sat with the boxes of paperwork in our hands. We ate cold rice and cold vegetables, something we could heat on the camping stove because the city had turned our electricity into an active rumor. We could hear, at the edges, a vehicle's muffled engine. A neighbor's porch light clicked on and off like a Morse code of unease. The house itself felt like a body with an infection, the warmth gone from certain parts, and the rest bearing a heat that was more pain than comfort. Jonah reached for my hand across the table. The motion was small, domestic, and absolutist, a line that said, "I am here. I am choosing you again." We had not yet arrived at the place where the public would come down like a storm and strip us bare. We were still in the part of the story where the weather arranged itself in small but ominous ways. He ran his thumb along the seam of my palm the way someone checks for a pulse. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will go to the county office again. I will ask them for logs. I will ask for anyone who remembers seeing unusual activity. I will talk to the man who resigned. I will ask him to tell what he knows." His voice held the kind of ordinary steadiness that is most alarming. Not flamboyant, not loud, not violent.
but the sort of resolve that calls for retribution of a different kind. Truth. Be careful, I said once more. Not because I wanted him to cow, but because every small brave act in our town had a cost attached to it like a toll. He smiled, the sort of small, private smile that is a covenant. I did something today, he said. Not big, not the kind of thing people write songs about. I wrote a post. I said I would stand by what is right. I said I would not condone stealing someone's home. On social? I asked, surprised and a little frightened. On the feed, he said. Not to inflame, just to say what I said here. He tapped at his phone as if it were a key and not a detonator. That could cost you, I warned. It wasn't a threat, but a recognition of fact. It could, he said. It could cost me dinners at the Harrow table. It could close doors. But it also tells people where I stand. I can't be both sides.
That was the small sacrificial act, the equivalent of the $3 in another life, an action that costs socially and perhaps economically, but that cannot be turned into a commodity. He hadn't bought me. He had not staged some theatrical purchase. He had simply refused to let his silence be the thing that confirmed my diminishment. He had chosen to upset the ledger. Word spread, as it always does. The post got traction, some supportive comments, some venom, and then the predictable chorus of people who like the spectacle more than they like the truth. Evelyn's circle grew colder and more inventive. She did not appear in public denouncing us with the heat of a firebrand. Instead, she worked through intermediaries. She brought forward an old acquaintance who claimed to have an affidavit that nearly confirmed the story she wanted. She did so with the practiced patience of someone who knows how to let the law appear to have produced its own neat result. On a damp afternoon, when the clouds held the light like a withheld vote, my phone buzzed with a message from the attorney. The server logs had been requested, and the response was late. Late in bureaucracy is an inconvenient truth that carries a smell of delay and an implication of interference. When the attorney finally called back, his voice was clipped, and the sound of his coffee cup moved in the background. "They're giving us everything," he said, "but not without time. There's a back-channel request for extended review. It's the sort of thing you see when someone's trying to slow a case down. You can bet they'll drag this to the point where people lose heart." "They want to starve us out," I said. "Or they'll wait until the difference between hope and patience is too expensive," he said. "We can push. We can subpoena. But we'll need more money for forensic analysis of the documents. The logs will show us edits and access, but someone will have to testify to it." Jonah was quiet on the phone. He took the shape of the problem like a man learning to carry a new instrument. "We will find it," he said finally. The kind of confident sentence that gathers courage. "We will get what we need." And we tried. We knocked on doors. We asked the resigned notary's assistant to come in and speak. She met us in the kitchen with her hands folded and her eyes like someone who had been kept awake by a secret. She confirmed, in the small grammar of truth, that a file had been altered after hours, that a call had been made that shouldn't have been, that someone had come in with an envelope and left with a different purpose. She showed us an email she had written and then withdrawn from fear. She had deleted the message because the man who took the envelope had a reputation, and she had had a mortgage. It was an ordinary moral failure, not epic, but real, the kind of thing people do because of the weight of their own bills. She agreed, eventually and tremblingly, to speak to our attorney. It was a small crack in a dam. But an hour after she agreed, the lights in our small neighborhood blinked, and the silence outside our windows felt loaded with a purpose. Someone spray-painted a word across the side of our shed. Thief. It was childish and heavy and meant to be seen. Jonah found it at dawn, his face gone raw and clear as a hand. "It will get worse," he said, and the words were not meant to surprise me. They were the arithmetic of bullying. Escalate until you break the will of the other. We spent the day scraping and repainting and talking to neighbors, and with each scrape the town's gossip moved like weather. Some people offered water, some looked away, some crossed the street. The moral geometry of small towns is awkward. It often gives a louder ear to those who hold money, because money buys the time for one to have their voice heard. We found ourselves in that uncomfortable position of not just defending property, but defending the shape of ourselves. At night, Jonas sat on the back step and looked at the garden, where the beans had sent up their green insistence. I joined him and leaned against his shoulder, our hands tangled in the way people who are learning how to be brave together do. He pulled the wool of a cuff over his knuckles, and the motion was domestic and close and absolute. "If this keeps up," he said softly, "we'll lose time, we'll lose sleep, but we won't lose the house because we stop. We'll lose it only if we let them make giving up cheaper than standing."
His voice held the fierce arithmetic of someone refusing to calculate his life in terms of surrender. It made me love him where I did, at the place where he was willing to lose good things to be right. But it also made me wary. Heroism is not absent of cost. It is only sometimes lovely in the clean way stories suggest. That week, Louise knocked on our door again. She carried a small tape recorder and a bag of cookies. She had dust in the crease of her knuckles. "You ask for a witness," she said. "My sister's boy, he works at the coffee shop, the one by the post. He said he remembered seeing Evelyn and the accountant in town with an envelope. He said they looked nervous. It's nothing but a thing that feels like a thing." We took the thing that felt like a thing and put it into our lawyer's hands. We filed motions that had to be dressed in the meticulous grammar of the law. The filing demanded a sequence of evidence and witness statements. Our case was a quilt of small pieces. A clerk who printed logs, a resigned notary who would speak, a neighbor who remembered, a social post that showed Jonah's public choice. The good in our story was the accumulation of small brave acts, and that gave me, in a strange way, a sense of being told that we had a chance. Chance is polite until it is not.
The following Friday, a woman I had only met once at an event for the Chamber of Commerce, Gabrielle, a volunteer at the Historic Commission, came to the house with the sort of official small smile people practice in a mirror. She told us that a former neighbor of the Harrows had come forward unexpectedly to say that there had been talk of transferring certain holdings and that she had once overheard Evelyn mention putting things in order. It was the sort of testimony that smelled of old gatherings in parlors and of people who had watched wealth passed down like heirlooms rather than earned. It was enough to get the attention of the newspapers, and more dangerous for us, of the kind of person who understands the calculus of pressure. Evelyn retaliated not with a blow, but with redundancy. She filed a countersuit alleging defamation. The legal machine ground both ways. We found ourselves hemmed in by motions and counters, and by the horror of having one's private life folded and creased into public pieces. And then, on a morning that smelled of rain and gunmetal, someone attempted to break into our shed. The lock had been forced, tools were thrown about, and some of our gardening implements were missing. The police took a report. They wore the tired sympathy of bureaucrats who are quietly tired of property crimes and who suspect a motive but are cautious to say so. They suggested cameras and motion sensors and told us to be careful. "We will be," Jonah assured them. His voice said the thing he always said when he meant it. Not bravado, but warning. That night we set up a cheap motion camera someone had given us and sat in the living room with a lamp that felt too bright for the old furniture. We talked in small sentences, in the unadorned language of people making lists of what they could lose and what they could not. "When this is done," I said, "if we keep the house, if we win the right to be here, I will not let people like you hang over my head ever again." He kissed my temple, and it was a small, private ceremony. "You don't belong in the kitchen," he said, and there was no triumph in his voice, only the matter-of-factness of someone correcting an old ledger. "You belong where you choose to be." Those words were the beginning of a new geometry for us, not the poetry of grand gestures, but the slow accrual of action that says, "I will be public when my partner needs me." It did not erase the insult, it reframed it. It was not purchase, it was covenant. As the first part of the fight continued to coil, small sparks began to appear in places we could not easily engineer. A clerk who had been afraid to testify made a call that put an amendment to a work log on record. A retired surveyor produced an old map that suggested the cornerstones had been misfiled by a generation. Louisa's sister's boy recorded a snippet of conversation he had overheard, a small detail about an envelope that, when compared with the server logs, made an odd pattern. These were not dramatic discoveries. They were grains of evidence, like the kinds you collect when making bread. We needed many. And in the middle of the slow building of casework, we continued to stitch the life that made the legal battle feel worth the cost. We painted the porch despite the injunction notice, not to defy the court, but to refuse to let fear make our house a ruin. We put new soil in the bean bed and planted bulbs for a spring that was surely a long way off. We braided hair and folded laundry and mended shirts at night, because the domestic is not lesser, it is the horizon by which you measure what is at stake. One evening, after a day of hearings and the whispering of neighbors, Jonah left for the courthouse with a folder under his arm. He kissed me briefly at the doorway, his lips warm and quick. "Wait here," he said, not in command, but in promise. I sat by the window and watched the street where his silhouette had disappeared into the edge of town. The porch light hummed. A single kettle sat on the small stove, its whistle a tiny, stubborn song. I placed my palm on the table and let the wood press back into my skin. The war was a series of small things, but they were enough to make entire worlds tilt. At 2 in the morning, there was a knock, a cautious thing, 3 light beats on the front door. My heart leaped in a way that felt foolish and essential. I opened the door to find a man I had never met before, but whose palms were the wrong kind of steady for a late-night caller. He held out a folded printout, and when I looked past it to his face, I saw the kind of exhaustion that belongs to someone who has been keeping a secret too long. "I work at the county," he said. His voice was low, careful. "IT, Thomas Reed. I saw something on the server. Couldn't sleep." There was a wetness to his hands, the rim of his coat still damp from the rain. He wouldn't come in more than a step. He cradled the paper as if it might crumble. Jonah had rounded the corner of the porch. He had that small, immediate alarm that a man gets when something is shifting in the dark. "Show me," he said, without formalities. There was no theatricality in it, only the practical demand of 2 people who had learned to meet trouble without letting it grow teeth. Thomas spread the prints across our kitchen table, as if setting down plates. The pages were dense with rows of timestamps and IP addresses, and the jargon of server authentication. At one point there was a column that read, "Admin access," with a time and a machine name. My eyes tried to follow, then slipped. My hands remembered doing accounting in the rough way a haphazard farmer remembers planting, by touch and repeat. "It shouldn't be possible," Thomas said. "The logs show an access from a Harrow-owned IP the night the file was altered, but the admin was different. It was someone with keys." He swallowed. "I thought it was a glitch. Then I saw the pattern."
They masked the access through a proxy to look like routine work. In the thin lamplight, the letters looked like a map of trespasses. Jonah reached for the pages and didn't look at me right away. He read, the way someone reads a map to find where the boundary has been moved. When he finally met my eyes, the expression there was a kind of cold gratitude, an acknowledgement for which no one makes a toast. "You're sure?" Jonah asked. "Yes." Thomas's mouth tightened. "I can go public, but I had to be sure. I lost my job once for whistleblowing. I learned to wait until the evidence can't be ignored." The cliff of danger was a long one. You could fall off it slowly, losing savings and sleep and friends, or you could step back, bury the thing, and let someone else live a lie. Thomas had not wanted to be the kind of person who let that happen. We asked him if he would testify. He hesitated, the same way the clerk had before with the printouts, with small human things that made a law office in a town council sound like the mouths of animals. "Not yet," he said. "I need assurance I won't be crushed." We offered what we could: confidentiality, the lawyer's promise of subpoena protection, and a bowl of my stew. He ate, and between spoons, he told us that he had been the one to notice the proxy. "It wasn't digital magic," he said. "It was access. Someone with inside information used an account that shouldn't have been in play. They masked the trail, but left a breadcrumb. I'm tired of breadcrumbs leading to empty plates." When he left, the night felt a shade brighter and also somehow more dangerous. Light reveals, after all, what is hiding. We taped the prints into the file our attorney had built. The folder thickened like a small book. Each piece of evidence made the story less of a rumor and more of a thing that could be examined. Each new witness, each technical printout, was a piece of armor you can make and then mend with someone else. That week, the harassment escalated into something louder. A series of anonymous flyers appeared in our mailbox, typed sheets that accused us of unsympathetic things with the flourish of somebody comfortable wielding rumor as a blade. Someone shot out a tire on Jonah's old truck one morning. A neighbor reported seeing a figure in a hood near our shed at dusk. We called the police and filled out forms and waited in queues for answers. The police were kind but practical. "We'll patrol more frequently," they promised, and their cars made slow loops that felt like the beat of a worried heart. The town watched. The town recorded. The town's gossip began to change its voice from curiosity to something that sounded like moral calculation. When the attorney called with the news that the county would comply with a subpoena for the server logs, but that the judge had granted a brief continuance at Evelyn's behest, I felt something like a physical collapse inside my chest, a muffled clap of disappointment.
"They've asked for an extension," he said. "They're buying time. It's what they do." "You said they'd give us something to cross-examine," I said, and the words left my mouth like a buoy thrown into a wide water. "We'll get the logs," he said. "It will take time and money. You may want to prepare for a long fight. They can and they will make it expensive. Then we'll make it important.
Jonah said, almost to himself. He had the particular cadence of a man who had decided irreversibly what he would become. We won't let them starve us out. In the small quiet that followed, Louise arrived with another small contribution, an old photograph taken at a garden club meeting. In the photograph, Evelyn stood beside a man who later would be named as the Harrow account manager. In her hand she held an envelope, and her smile was the one people practice for family portraits. Photographs make history visible in a way that words often can't. They are a proof that once something happened, and sometimes what once happened can be held up in court like a fossil. We were collecting fossils, yes, little imprints of what had been. Each one, when set beside another, made a silhouette you could not dismiss. The next public hearing was scheduled for a humid afternoon. The room was fuller this time. A kind of attention had settled over the town that was both voyeuristic and civic. Cameras from the local paper leaned in as if to ingest the air. Evelyn arrived beside a measured man in a suit, the accountant she favored, and her smile had the practiced ease of a woman whose social instruments are finely tuned. She greeted people like a person who knows how to hand out sympathy selectively. Her supporters were ready with petitions and letters whose ink smelled of effort and of money. They had lined up the town's small architecture of favor in her defense. When our attorney stood to call Thomas to the stand, my body did an odd thing. It trembled in precise places, like a string plucked at an intimate frequency. Thomas came forward with his sleeves rolled up, the same hands that had steadied our files that night. His testimony was careful and technical, and in the moments when he delivered the server logs, he translated digital speech into human grammar. He explained the proxy, the administrative keys, and how access patterns could be used to mask culpability. He did not speak philosophically. He spoke like a man who loves his job and had learned to be a small instrument of truth within it. The notary's assistant came after him. She sat with hands that folded like someone who had carried a secret too long. She told the hearing that someone had asked her to fetch a certain envelope and to alter a scan. "I was frightened," she said. "I was asked to help keep things smooth. I thought I could help by making it easier. I didn't understand what it would mean." She testified against the grain of fear. Her voice quavered at moments.
When she said the words, "I signed a document I later regret," the gallery shifted. There was a rustle like someone making room for a new truth. The retired surveyor who had produced the map we found leaned forward to corroborate the timeline of land transfers. Louise's sister's boy was called, and he recounted the cafe conversation he'd overheard. A mosaic forms slowly when many people place small tiles in the same pattern, and at the panel's center, an image was becoming clear. Evelyn's lawyer cross-examined with a practiced hand. "Is it not true," he asked, "that access logs can be tampered with by a malicious actor? Is it not possible that you are mistaken?" Thomas looked at the lawyer as if he were inspecting a broken hinge. "It is possible," he said, "but the pattern here is consistent with someone who had inside access and the ability to mask that access. It is not a single anomaly. It is a pattern." The attorney for Evelyn tried other moves. He suggested our neighbor-sourced evidence was hearsay. He argued that a family's history of organizing its holdings implies an authority that history must respect. Evelyn herself took the stand, not to confess, but to assert the righteousness of a family's duty to preserve its legacy. Her voice was particularly cold when she spoke of stewardship and duty. She insisted that she had acted within her rights, and that any alteration to records must be a clerical error or an inconvenient coincidence. But the more she spoke, the more her words read like someone disciplining an old fear into a tidy sentence. At one point, under a gentle but insistent question from our attorney, she faltered and admitted that she had been worried about losing what she had worked for: homes, positions, the quiet structure of how favors had always been done. It was neither exculpatory nor monstrous. It was simply human. She had feared diminishment, and from that place had chosen exercises of control. It explained the behavior without excusing it. The hearing's final hours unspooled with the slow, precise machinery of the law. Motions, pauses, the whispered conferencings of counsel. We waited in the hallway in that time with a trio of other people who wore looks like masks: anger, hope, fatigue. Jonas sat with his hands folded and a newspaper across his knees. He touched my knee now and then with a small, steadying tap that meant more than anything that he was present, and that his presence cost him something. When the judge's clerk finally came out and held up a small card with the decision, our hearts fluttered in a way that felt foolishly like birds. The continuance was denied. The injunction was partially lifted pending a fuller forensic investigation. It was not a thunderclap of victory. It was a small, crucial clearing.
If the law could not be fully decisive yet, it had at least admitted the possibility that the record was flawed.
Evelyn retreated into the kind of quiet that a woman with influence can affect. Predictable statements, legal maneuverings, and the sculpting of public opinion. She filed a countersuit alleging defamation. The legal wrangling would drag on, but for the moment the town breathed differently. Whispers softened into conversations. Some neighbors walked across our lawn with casseroles, like small offerings of a public apology. A local columnist wrote a piece that called for patience and fairness. People who had kept a polite distance began to look at us with the eyes of people who had finally seen the seams of a garment. The months that followed were a series of incremental ventilations. The forensic team pulled server backups and reconstituted access logs. The notary's assistant, after her testimony, agreed to participate in a longer deposition with some protections. Thomas publicly turned over his notes, an act of bravery that cost him a day of anonymous comments, but gained him a day of rest. The retired surveyor's map was compared and matched with the county archives, and inconsistencies were annotated in red pencil. Sometimes the work was tedious and humdrum. Sometimes it was small triumphs, an old email discovered in an archive, an affidavit corrected. The legal costs mounted like a silent demand. Jonah went extra shifts at his part-time job, and I grew more frugal with my purchases. The retainer fund we had paid was a slow-bleeding thing we watched like the pulse of a family. And yet, through the tediousness, life arrived in small, indestructible bursts. We painted the porch again on a Tuesday afternoon because the injunction was careful and precise, and because paint resists intimidation in a way the law sometimes cannot. People paused and asked why we risked contempt. Because, Jonah said to a young neighbor peering over the fence, some houses need to look lived in. We held small dinners and invited the neighbors who had offered help. Louise brought rhubarb pie that tasted of late spring. We braided each other's hair on nights when the legal calls came through thick and scratched our sleep. The ritual of my fingers through Jonah's hair became a liturgy, an unspoken vow. I would braid while he told me about his day and his small frustrations with people who measured value with cash flow instead of with courage. He, in turn, would mend my work jacket at the elbow and joke about the exact number of stitches it took to make a seam keep. The public smear campaign never stopped. Evelyn's supporters wrote letters to editors, and a small group picketed our street with signs that read "Preserve our heritage" and "History matters." It was childish and earnest and terrifying in its capacity to make people look away. At one of those protests, Jonah's uncle walked by with his dog and did not turn his head. He had once been the uncle who patted Jonah's shoulder with a patronizing pride.
He now walked with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. One morning, midwinter, our attorney called to say he had received a break. A third-party audit of the county server had produced a report that matched Thomas's observations. There had been administrative access from a Harrow IP on specific dates that corresponded to when the deed document had been altered. The audit traced that access to an account that, on the network, had been used by a particular machine, the same machine that the notary's assistant had said was used to handle certain scans. The mathematical, sterile language of the audit gave way to a simple human truth. Someone with access had altered the record. "You're sure?" I asked, because there is always an inverse of hope, denial, which can feel safer. "Our experts are sure," the attorney said. "We can move to present this in court. It's the kind of evidence a judge can't just wave aside." The presentation of the audit was not dramatic. It was a patient showing of facts, IP addresses, timestamps, corroborating testimony. But when the judge read aloud the technical findings and then asked if Evelyn's counsel had any explanation for the admin access, there was a pause in which money and social capital sounded like a thin song. The counsel offered the usual, plausible deniability, claims of coincidence. But the audit's chain was stubborn, and the notary's assistant, when asked to compare the signature on the contested document with the scanned signature, said she had seen the substitution. The retired surveyor's annotated map suggested that a supposed transfer had no recorded physical mark. The counsel did not apportion malice in a theatrical moment, but it did recognize the pattern. After that hearing, the town's posture shifted in a way that was almost visible. Evelyn's invitations were returned with polite notes of regret. Her attendance at certain civic events dwindled. It was not the legal blow that toppled her. It was the rearrangement of a network. People who had once deferred to her money and status found that association could cost them their reputations. A few familiar faces offered us apologies, so tentative they were almost prayer. Apology has a voice in small towns that sounds like someone clearing a throat. In the quiet that came after, we did not celebrate with fanfare. We planted bulbs in the garden, making promises to a spring that might never feel fully secure.
Jonah fixed the loose picket we had been meaning to straighten for 2 summers. We went to bed early, because the litigious world wears you down in a way that makes early hours sacred. One night, after we had climbed a series of small procedural victories, and the house had for a time become again our house, Evelyn came to our door. She did not arrive with lawyers. She came with a small motion stating that she would withdraw certain claims pending further private mediation. She carried no plastic bouquet of false contrition.
Instead, she had a quiet that was almost courtly, an exhausted civility. "I can't have this continue," she said, without looking at the map of our porch. Her voice held a tiredness. "The cost, to everyone, is more than anything I intended. I made a choice that I thought would carry the family's obligations forward. I see now that I did it with the wrong hands." I watched the muscles around Jonah's jaw tighten and ease. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He simply stood, the way people do when they are witnessing the small death of a story they've been told. "You hurt us," I said, because it needed to be said plainly, and not as a plea for recompense, but as an inventory. Evelyn's eyes had a wetness to them that was surprising. "I did," she said. "I was afraid of being smaller than I am. I thought keeping things tight inside my control would keep me safe." It was not absolution. It was an explanation that sat in the middle like a raw thing. The town had watched a strong woman for a long time. To see her fall from omnipotence into remorse was a complicated sympathy. People felt relief in the vindication, but a residue of discomfort that comes when justice and habit are disentangled. In the months that followed, we accepted certain practical turns, a partial settlement that required oversight of records, and a public apology, written with the careful hand of lawyers. Evelyn stepped down from a board she'd been on for decades. She gave a small talk about stewardship that read like a curated regret. She did not vanish. She moved through the town with a different rhythm, less a person of eminence, and more a human being who had to reconfigure her identity. We kept our house. The title remained in our name. The injunction against altering our property was lifted. The legal costs took a bite out of our savings and made our prudence something of a constant companion. But the gardens sent up little green things that felt like small triumphs. The beans that had once been tender shoots were now twisting toward the sky. The town's opinion parted into new lines. Some people apologized in the quiet tactics of gifts and casseroles. Others kept their distance with the economic ease of those who still found it expensive to be friendly to someone once contested. Social currency rearranged itself into new accounts. Our marriage, though, shifted almost imperceptibly in the ways that matter. The small acts we had performed, braiding hair, sharing sleepless nights, stacking receipts for the attorney, painting the porch, did something to alter the geometry of our love. Instead of one of us occupying the role of a caretaker and the other the object of protection, we arranged ourselves into a functional equality. Jonah's act of stepping into the public was not a purchase. It was a choice. He had given money, yes, and risked the family's displeasure, yes, and posted his conviction, yes.
But his truest currency was his willingness to change his social alignment in order to stand beside me when the world tried to make an old story the only story. There remained always the memory of Evelyn's line, "People like you belong in the kitchen." It had lodged in me like a splinter, small and stubborn. At first, it had made me small and sharp, and then, gradually, it had become something to work around. I turned it over and thought about what it meant. Not literal occupation, but a term meant to reduce and to prescribe. The fight redefined who belonged where. It taught me that belonging is not a label applied by others, but a place you create through your choices. One winter evening, after the legal dust had settled into its less dramatic forms, we sat in our kitchen with our palms red from washing a season's worth of dishes. The kettle whistled a soft, familiar song. I reached up and brushed a smear of flour from Jonah's cheek. He grinned the way men do when you find the corner of their dignity and tuck it back in. "You don't belong in the kitchen," he said, and there was a steadiness in his voice that had none of the earlier showmanship. "You belong wherever you want to be."
I laughed then, and it was the small, private sound of two people who had been carved by storms and were now learning how to braid their scars into something like comfort. People like you belong where you choose, I said, echoing Evelyn's original cruelty and folding it into a different grammar. We planted bulbs beneath the window that spring. The soil was heavy and cold, but generous if coaxed. Jonah knelt with me on the ground while the dirt angled into our palms. We pressed down the bulbs like poor people making small investments in hope. The beans next to the path were replaced with a row of onions. The house smelled of earth and oil and the copper of coming rain. At night, when the town was quiet and the porch light flickered, we would braid one another's hair. It was a ridiculous and sacred thing. My fingers in his hair, his thick strands catching like rope. We made small vows that were not restful but resolute. To speak the truth. To stand when the world sought to quiet us. To keep our hands busy with honest work. We did not pretend everything was healed. There were long evenings when we replayed what had happened and argued about what might have been done differently. There were still moments when people we used to consider friends failed to answer our greetings. Evelyn visited from time to time with notes that had the faint smell of lavender and a crispness of formality. Once she sent us a pie and an apology that arrived by way of a neutral neighbor. It was not a comfortable reconciliation, but a necessary reweaving. The town moved on in the way towns do, slow, practical, and with a memory that softens into a story told at kitchen tables by people who insist it's instructive rather than scandalous.
Our story became one such text, a caution for the ambitious, a lesson for the fearful, a quiet encouragement for those who had been told they belonged only in certain places. We told it in our small way, when people asked about the paint on the porch, when neighbors wondered about our courage, when a new couple moved in down the street and asked how to make themselves at home. People like you belong in the kitchen, the line would sometimes surface in those tender retellings, less a barb and more a barometer. I'd say the words aloud and then let them hang for a breath. But also, I'd add, because truth is accumulative, people like us belong wherever we choose to be. And Jonah would nod, as if to underline the grammatical correction. We make the choice together, he'd say. It was a small arithmetic of partnership. Months later, in the long, soft, late afternoon of an autumn that had finally decided to turn, I found Evelyn sitting on our porch swing. She had come without fanfare. Her hands were bare and steady. She looked at the house as if measuring it, not with the judgment of ownership, but with the wonder of someone who had been given a chance to see what possession actually involves. Daily care. I didn't understand how much a place can be someone's mind, she said. Her voice had shrunk into something raw and true. When I thought I could move lines with ink and signatures, I thought I was protecting my family. I forgot the people who lived. I'm sorry. We sat in a silence that was an unglued thing. The porch creaked its familiar sigh. Then Jonah stood and went into the kitchen. He came back with 2 mugs of tea, and we passed them around like a small offering. It's hard, I said, to be undone and to try to be good afterward. It is, she agreed, but it's the only way I know now to begin. If the story has a moral, it's not a triumphalist one. We had not toppled a tyrant single-handedly, nor had we become a symbol for the whole town. We'd done something quieter. We had shown that ordinary people could gather the patience to collect evidence, the audacity to ask a clerk for a printout, the bravery to step forward and name a truth, and the tenderness to keep a house warm through a dark season. We had also shown that a marriage could be reconfigured from ledger and duty to choice and accountability. People still said cruel things sometimes. There were Sundays when a cousin might offer a look that tried to measure me against an old, petty rubric. But the sting dulled with time, partly because we were no longer hiding the fight, partly because other people began to see that the cost of maintaining a false smallness is paid not just in money, but in the slow attrition of integrity. There is a smallness to domestic rituals that is deceptive. The act of braiding hair is not trivial. It is a slow, patient thing, an exercise in touching, in mapping, in promise.
My hands know the exact angle to tuck a stray strand into the plait so that it will not fall out. Jonah's fingers know how I like the rhythm and sometimes tighten a knot to make it hold longer. We braided the final morning of that autumn while the kettle sang and the beans, now a stubborn patch of green, leaned toward the light. I braided slowly, and in the quiet between my fingers and the hair, the memory of Evelyn's line rose up. People like you belong in the kitchen, I said, and then I wrapped the thought around a different syntax. People like us belong where we choose.
We belong at the table, where we cook and where we speak. We belong at the meeting, where we ask for fairness. We belong on the porch, where we watch the town and plant bulbs. To belong is not to be assigned, it is to decide. He smiled, his mouth pulling in a familiar way, and kissed my temple with a gentleness that had become our covenant. You choose, he said simply, and I choose you. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its habitual noises. Dogs, distant lawnmowers, a child's laughter that sounded like wind chimes. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of coffee and spice. I placed the last braiding ribbon, and Jonah tied it off with a practiced knot. There was no triumphant fanfare, no official recognition beyond a court's practical finding and a couple of op-eds. But the small, steady work had made a space we could keep without apologizing for its size or its shape. When I first heard those words at Evelyn's table, they had been intended to place me like an object. They had been delivered like a verdict. Now, years on, they had become a measure by which I could define myself, by where I chose to be, and by the acts I performed there. The kitchen remained a place I came to often, because I liked to cook and because it was where I braided hair and balanced ledgers, but it was not the only measure of who I was. If this story is speaking to you, and if you find something in it that feels like kinship, if you've ever been told you belong only in a corner, subscribe and come back. There are more of these stories, stitched by small lives like ours. When the evening settled, Jonah and I sat with cups cooling in our palms and the radio murmuring a low hum. The beans at the garden's edge rustled with a faint, insistent wind. I thought about the work still to be done, rebuilding trust with those who had wavered, repairing small domestic fissures, paying legal fees that had become a ghost in our finances. I thought about the notary's assistant and Thomas and the retired surveyor, all people who had given pieces of themselves to the slow work of truth. I thought about Evelyn and the way fear can make a powerful person seize at anything that feels like an anchor. I used to think belonging was a place handed to you, I said. Now I know it's more like a house you build. Jonah put his arm around my shoulders, and we sat like people who had learned how to be steady.
We'll keep building, he said. Outside, a truck rumbled by, and a porch light blinked. Inside, in our modest kitchen, 2 hands braided a ribbon into a last tidy knot. The line that had once sought to define me had been overturned not by a single grand gesture, but by 1,000 small ones. Refusal, companionship, evidence, patience. I closed my eyes and let that truth settle in like warm bread. We had chosen our place together, never purchased, never owned by anyone else, and we intended to keep it.